All right. So this evening is the Swan next. So before we begin, a reading. This from the voice of the sun. Saith the great law, in order to become the knower of all self, thou hast first of self to be the knower. To reach the knowledge of that self, thou hast to give up self to non-self, being to non-being, and then thou canst repose between the wings of the great bird. Aye, sweet as rest between the wings of that which is not born nor dies, but is the throughout eternal ages. Bestride the bird of life if thou wouldst know. Give up thy life if thou wouldst live. So we give to you our own David Grossman. Thank you.
Friends, tonight we journey into what we might call the esoteric world of ornithology, as we mainly contemplate that rather unique and beautiful bird, the swan. And it has really captivated the human imagination for literally thousands of years. The fact is, we seem to have a fascination for birds in general, partly because they can do what we can't, fly. Birds also possess other qualities of note, which we pay tribute to. Some sing beautiful songs, show strength and courage. Others exhibit grace and flight and are amazing pilots, navigating great distances in disciplined formations, as we see with geese. Birds have impressive engineering abilities in building nests, along with their agility and beauty. We, on the other hand, are able to spread our proverbial wings, those of the imagination. We travel far and wide, creating many things individually and collectively, from forms of religion to societies and forms of government, creatively expressing ourselves in the arts, applied science, and technology, including designing and building flying machines. Still, to some degree, psychologically and physically, we are earthbound creatures. Birds, on the other hand, are both of the earth and the air. And some birds embrace a third element, that of water, like the swan. It's been said somewhere that the magician is one who stands at the shore with one foot on the earth, the other in the water, and his head in the air. Well, we find magical birds in mythology and literature, like the phoenix, for example. And for example, sorry, trying to get to my next slide here. The phoenix here, symbolizing immortality, resurrection, and life after death. The phoenix is a symbol of renewal, rebirth, and reincarnation. It's said that all that remains of the burnt phoenix is a shining ember representing the immortal soul, the higher self, the source of transformation and continuance. The phoenix myth is found in various cultures around the world. In ancient Greek and Egyptian myths, the phoenix is associated with the sun god. There were times, other cycles, when we were more in touch with nature generally, more pantheistic in the positive sense, as we see, say, with indigenous peoples in America and elsewhere. Here, we think of the Hopi people for their example of expressing a deep reverence for life. HPB points out another bird in The Secret Doctrine. She says there that the ibis religiosa had and has magical properties in common with many other birds, the albatross preeminently, and the mythical white swan, the swan of eternity or time, the Kalahansa. Were it otherwise, indeed, why should all the ancient peoples, who were no more fools than we are, says HPB, have had such a superstitious dread of killing certain birds? In Egypt, he who killed an ibis or the golden hawk, the symbol of the sun and Osiris, risked and could hardly escape death. The veneration of some nations for birds was such that Zoroaster, in his precepts, forbids their slaughter as a heinous crime. This is certainly a far cry from, unfortunately, our gun-happy times when birds are shot and killed for mere sport. But for thousands of years, the ibis, I'm having trouble getting my slides moving here, sorry. The ibis seen here is associated with the Egyptian primal god Thoth, the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, we're told, and the scribe. Sorry, and the scribe. Thoth's beak even looks like a writing instrument. He is said to be the most ancient and distinctive of the Egyptian gods. Then, of course, we should not overlook the peacock. The peacock. With which one can hardly believe one's eyes, its radiant color, its span of feathers, and the mystical eyes on every one. It seems to be more mythic than real when one is actually seen. And the peacock has been used symbolically relating to spiritual ideas in various cultures throughout time. And interestingly, in 1963, kind of a recent date for a country like India, India made the peacock its official bird, much like the eagle is for the United States. As we heard interesting things about the eagle here not too long ago. But tonight, we will fly with the swan, that beautiful, elegant, and graceful bird that has inspired the human imagination, the image of which we find throughout history in the most ancient of the Vedas, in Greek mythology, in Norse and Irish legends, in art and poetry, from the distant past into the present. The swan has inspired us over time. Did you two see it, drifting all night on the Black River? Did you see it in the morning, rising into the silvery air? An armful of white blossoms, a perfect commotion of silk and linen as it leaned into the bondage of its wings, a snowbank, a bank of lilies, biting the air with its black beak. Did you hear it, fluting and whistling a shrill, dark music, like the rain pelting the trees, like a waterfall, knifing down the black ledges? And did you see it, finally, just under the clouds, a white cross streaming across the sky, its feet like black leaves, its wings like the stretching light of the river? And did you feel it in your heart, how it pertained to everything? And have you too finally figured out what beauty is for? And have you changed your life? The swan has not only been an inspiration to artists and poets throughout time, like we heard here from the late Mary Oliver, but we see it as a grand metaphysical symbolism, as HPB points out in the most ancient Vedic teachings, representing the most metaphysical concepts. So without getting too embroiled in the complexity of it all, that is to say, the mysteries of the pre-cosmic, the cosmic, the causeless cause, and what is referred to as the first cause or logos, and then the subsequent manifestations. Let us take a look what HPB first reveals from pages 78 to 80 in Book 1 of The Secret Doctrine, and maybe a few other comments further on. But first, as a side note of interest, let us go back a little earlier. It's interesting that throughout the SD, there are hundreds and hundreds of page headings which offer really deep meditative thoughts and ideas. You could just go through these really and have things to meditate on for a lifetime. But in the area we're going to be drawing from, on page 71, dealing with stanza 3, the heading there says, light emerges from darkness. Then on 75, the heading reads, noumenal and phenomenal light. Noumenal light, phenomenal light. We really ever reflect on what's the difference and what do those things mean? And again, on 79, primeval radiations from the unity. HPB unpacks in this part of the SD the symbolism of the swan, Kalahansa, and its various manifestations and possible misrepresentations, which she clears up through a few explanations. Admittedly, this is a bit lengthy, but we think worth the effort. So bear with us in this. So in the midst of these pages dealing with stanza 3 on page 77, it says, where was the germ and where was now darkness? Where is the spirit of the flame that burns in thy lamp, O Lanu? The germ is that, and that is light, the white, brilliant sun of the dark, hidden Father. And she goes on. The answer to the first question suggested by the second, which is the reply of the teacher to the pupil, contains in a single phrase one of the most essential truths of occult philosophy. It indicates the existence of things imperceptible to our physical senses, which are of far greater importance, more real and more permanent than those that appeal to these senses themselves. So before the Lanu can hope to understand the transcendentally metaphysical problem contained in the first question, he must be able to answer the second, while the very answer he gives to the second will furnish him with the clue to the correct reply to the first. And then down a few lines, she goes on, among such appellations given, of course, only in esoteric philosophy as the unfathomable darkness, the whirlwind, etc., it is also called the it of the Kalahansa, the Kalahamsa, and even the Kali-Hansa, black swan. Jumping ahead a bit on 79, the symbol of Hansa, whether I, he, goose, or swan, is an important symbol representing, for instance, divine wisdom, wisdom in darkness beyond the reach of men. For all exoteric purposes, Hansa, as every Hindu knows, is a fabulous bird, which when given milk mixed with water for its food in the allegory, separated the two, drinking the milk and leaving the water, thus showing inherent wisdom. Milk standing symbolically for spirit and water for matter. That this allegory is very ancient and dates from the very earliest archaic period is shown by the mention in Bhagavata Purana of a certain caste named Hamsa or Hansa, which was the one caste par excellence, when far back in the mists of a forgotten past, there was among the Hindus only one Veda, one deity, one caste. There is also a range in the Himalayas described in the old books as being situated north of Mount Meru called Hamsa and connected with episodes pertaining to the history of religious mysteries and initiations. So as to the name of Kalahansa being the supposed vehicle of Brahma Prajapati in the exoteric texts and translations of the Orientalists, it is quite a mistake, she says. Brahma, the neuter, is called by them Kalahansa, and Brahma, the male, Hansa Vahana, because for Sooth, his vehicle or Vahan is a swan or goose. And this is from the Hindu Classical Dictionary. But she says this is purely exoteric loss. Esoterically and logically, if Brahma, the infinite, is all that is described by the Orientalists, namely, agreeably with the Vedantic texts, an abstract deity in no way characterized by the description of any human attributes, and it is still maintained that he or it is called Kalahansa, then how can it ever become the Vahan of Brahma, the manifested finite God? It is quite the reverse. The swan or goose, Hansa, is the symbol of that male or temporary deity, as he, the emanation of the primordial ray, is made to serve as a Vahan or vehicle for that divine ray, which otherwise could not manifest itself in the universe, being antiphrastically itself an emanation of darkness, for our human intellect at any rate. It is Brahma, then, who is Kalahansa, and the ray, the Hansa Vahana. Just a little more here, because then in the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, she shines a little more light on this, saying that Kalahansa has a dual meaning. Exoterically, it is Brahma who is the swan, the great bird, the vehicle in which darkness manifests itself to human comprehension as light and this universe. But esoterically, it is darkness itself, the unknowable absolute, which is the source, firstly, of the radiation called the first logos, then of its reflection, the dawn, or the second logos, and finally, Brahma, the manifested light, or third logos. So there's our metaphysical level of talking about Kalahansa and the swan and deep things. But it is interesting how these metaphysical and spiritually symbolic ideas get passed down through time and to a lesser or greater degree are preserved in myths, stories, poetry, and art right up to the present day. They also get embellished as stories, changed and sometimes distorted, obscuring their original intent and embedded truths. So we find various versions of myths and stories that need to be explored to reveal the pearls and, you might say, veins of truth within them. A case in point, as some of us, I'm sure, are familiar with, is in the work of the artist Hilma af Klint. Seen here in a picture from 1895. She lived from 1862 to 1944, but has only really become widely known and gotten real recognition in more recent decades after, at least in America, the 1986 Los Angeles traveling exhibition titled Spiritual in Art. As a side note, the secret doctrine was actually displayed in that traveling exhibition around the country, which is pretty interesting. While trained as a classical painter, she became interested in all things occult, getting involved in spiritualism and then metaphysical subjects, studying the secret doctrine. We know she had a kind of discussing relationship with Rudolf Steiner, and she shifted her artwork. She was a very accomplished, classical painter as a young woman to reflect more abstract and esoteric subjects. And she created a series of paintings in 1914 and 15 called none other than The Swan. These were influenced by her studies, as we said, in the secret doctrine, as well as other esoteric writings, at least this is what we're told. At a recent exhibition of her swan work, art in Sweden, an introduction begins with the following. The majestic swan symbolized the grandeur of the spirit to Helena Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy, and this writer refers to it as a spiritualist movement of great interest to Hilma af Klint. In alchemy, the swan represents the union of opposites necessary for the creation of the philosopher's stone, a substance believed to turn base metals into gold. In this series, Klint blends such established symbolism with her own idiosyncratic interpretations. There are 24 paintings in all, as you can see here. As the series progresses, the color range expands and the swans are replaced with geometric forms suggestive of higher dimensions, including a vibratory color wheel, concentric circles. There's cubic forms there and mandala-like designs. And then the final painting shows the bird once again, the birds intertwined and reunited. So overall, one can explore and find very interesting symbolism in these paintings. And still the swan is a very sought after symbol that people are interested in and connect with. But long before thinkers like Dr. Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and others showed that myths were not merely to be looked at as overheated imaginative fairy tales, HPB in her writings was revealing that mythology was a means in times past through which physical, psychological, and spiritual truths were recorded and preserved, as well as historical facts and events, and often in a veiled fashion. And she emphasizes this with various statements really throughout her writings. So we thought it might be important here, because the swan certainly relates to this. Here are just a few of the many comments from HPB worth noting. She says, myth was the favorite and universal method of teaching in archaic times. We believe absolutely in ancient records and universal legends, she says in the SD. And then again in Isis, as to the myths, Plato declares in the Gorgias and Phaedon that they were the vehicles of great truths, well worth the seeking. She goes on in another place, the myths, says Horace in his Ars Poetica, have been invented by wise men to strengthen the laws and teach moral truths. And then there are examples, and we quote her, she says, examples of this to support the ancient claim of the philosophers that there is a logos in every mythos or a groundwork of truth in every fiction. And I'm sure many of us may have heard this statement or read it in the past from HPB, which is, it's still coming true today. More things are being discovered. Who can forget that Troy was once upon a time proclaimed a myth, and Homer a non-existing personage, while the existence of such cities as Herculaneum and Pompeii was denied and attributed to mere fairy legends. Yet Schliemann proved that Troy had really existed, and the two cities, though buried for long ages under the Vesuvian lava, have had their resurrection day and live again on the surface of the earth. How many more cities and localities called fabulous are on the list of future discoveries? How many more personages regarded as mythical will one day become historical? Those alone can tell who read the decrees of fate in the astral light. Excuse me 1 second. Applying the second object of the Theosophical movement, the comparison of ideas coming out of different cultures and traditions, we see many had similar myths and themes, even if separated by time and space. Two of these concerning the swan are that of Saraswati, from ancient Indian mythology, depicted as the wife or sometimes the consort of Brahma, the creator, and the myth of Leda and the Swan, which Westerners are more probably familiar with from Greek and Roman myth. Also, there have been many works of art depicting, often in various sensuous ways, Leda and the Swan by artists none other than Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and many others. In that story, the god Zeus, infatuated with Leda, takes the form of a swan and seduces, and in the story that we get now from it, rapes her, from which unfold other stories and ideas rolled out in Greek and Roman mythology. Without getting into too many details of the story, Leda eventually bears from two eggs from which are hatched none other than Helen of Troy. We get mainly the Iliad from that, and Clytemnestra, who became the wife of the ill-fated, really, eventually, Agamemnon, and the twins, Castor and Pollux, who later become the Gemini twins. In Indian mythology, the Hindu deity Brahma, who represents the power of creation, is referred to, interestingly, as Ekahamsa, the one swan. His feminine counterpart is Saraswati, who is also associated with the swan. And as with the story of Leda, Brahma also takes the form of a swan in some tellings and expresses his infatuation with her, according to Hindu mythology. Brahma, the creator god, did marry Saraswati, as said in some tellings, to be his daughter. Other stories show her as a consort and associate. So these stories kind of unroll and change throughout history a little bit. But overall, Saraswati, in her own right, as a goddess, is of the highest order, mainly known as the goddess of wisdom. Saraswati is often depicted riding a swan or Hamsa in Indian art, and her association with the swan is highlighted by the title Hamsa Vahini, which means she who has a Hamsa as her vehicle. In the most philosophical expression of Brahma and Saraswati together, she represents, we would think, Sophia, the divine feminine, the receptive, or that which receives the emanation or creative logos, the light from the ever unknowable darkness, sometimes referred to as the black swan. But returning to the Greek myth of Leda and the swan, that myth is thought to be at least maybe 500 years old, dating back to 400 BC. It's the earliest place where they found what they think is the work of a Greek artist sculpted the earliest known representation of the myth. It seems to have been a well-known story closer to its own time of creation, because interestingly enough, in a recent discovery, and, Theosophy says what goes around comes around, right? Archaeologists at Pompeii found a Roman fresco depicting Leda and the swan as recently as 2018. Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash when Mount Vesuvius erupted in the first century AD. It's a long time ago, and this painting is even older than that. The latest find is believed to have decorated a bedroom in a wealthy home near the ancient city center. So as mentioned earlier by HPB, Pompeii is just one example of what were first considered fanciful myths, and they turn out to be true. So one parallel in both the Hindu and Greek myths is that both Brahma and Zeus, the creator gods, take the form of swans and are infatuated with Saraswati and Leda, from which various stories emerge. And like all myths over time, they tend to be told and retold, and sometimes get twisted and degenerate as societies morally dip and become more materialistic. And as always, enlightening us to some degree. HPB addresses this exact fact in the SD. She says, one has to learn the reason of a symbol before one depreciates it. Pan, the great god of nature, was generally figured in connection with aquatic birds, geese especially, and so were other gods. If later on, with the gradual degeneration of religion, the gods to whom geese were sacred became priapic deities, priapic meaning basically sexual, it does not stand to reason that waterfowls were made sacred to Pan and other phallic deities, as some scoffers even of antiquity would have it, but that the abstract and divine power of creative nature had become grossly anthropomorphized. Nor does the Swan of Leda show priapic doings and her enjoyment thereof, as Mr. Hargrave Jennings chastely expresses it. For the myth is but another version of the same philosophical idea of cosmogony. Swans are frequently associated with Apollo, as they are the emblems of water and fire, sun, light also, before the separation of the elements. So the swan, along with ancient myths the bird appears in, have been kept alive in more or less meaningful forms down the ages through various philosophers, writers, and artists. In most all these stories, the swan is associated in some way with the inner or spiritual side of life. And besides the Hindu Saraswati and the Greek and Roman Leda, there are other legends that revolve around swans. The legend of the children of Lear, the Celtic swan myth, has long been told in Ireland and adopted in many forms of art and literature. And this Irish myth actually forms the basis, we found out, of the famous ballet. What ballet you think I'm talking about? Swan Lake, by Swan Lake by the Russian composer Tchaikovsky. And the roots of that myth can be traced back to around, we find 700 AD, passed down through the oral tradition, and so things changed. And as the myth appears today, it's mainly born out of the first written edition, which came out in the 1500s. We find the swan as a prominent symbol in Finnish folklore and mythology also. And there too, this is really kind of makes you shiver a little bit. In archaeological excavations done in the Karelia region, for example, a child was found and its body was laying upon the wing of a swan. And they actually have pictures of this, the discovery. And true to the course, in Finnish mythology and folklore, the swan is the divine messenger between the living and the dead. And some of you may know this, the Scandinavian countries, I didn't know this before, of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden are referred to as the five swans, which also figure into Norse folklore. And the national bird of Finland is a swan, specifically the whipper swan, which I'm showing you here. And the mute swan even recently became the national bird of Denmark in 1984, usurping the skylark. And I'm not sure why that switch was made, but that's the truth of it. So again, artists, writers, poets, and more recently, filmmakers have always kept alive symbolism and themes from ancient mythology. The very, of course, popular Star Wars by George Lucas is an obvious case in point. And one of the most famous books in English, James Joyce's Ulysses, considered a modernist classic, is a retelling of the Odyssey. And more recently, the acclaimed 1988 novel, maybe some of you have read it, The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, has classic mythological themes through the journey of its protagonist. And many similar ideas are delved into, as we know, by Joseph Campbell in his Hero with a Thousand Faces and other of his writings. And even a super successful sporting goods company is named after the flying Greek god of victory, Nike. But of course, we shouldn't leave out the Hans Christian Andersen children's story, should we, of the mid-19th century, The Ugly Duckling, a story with important mythical theme, misplaced and misidentified at first, shunned, banished, and after a lonely journey is transformed, so to speak, through time and experience into his beautiful, true identity of the Swan. Voice of the Silence, well, we could say first, this too can be the future of our evolutionary journey. So we think we will end here like we began with the Swan, reading what the Voice of the Silence says once more, saith the great law, in order to become the knower of all self, thou hast first of self to be the knower. To reach the knowledge of that self, thou hast to give up self to non-self, being to non-being. And then thou canst repose between the wings of the great bird. Sweet is rest between the wings of that which is not born, nor dies, but is the Om throughout eternal ages. And we might just mention before the last line, there's a footnote in the voice there, if you didn't notice it. And the footnote points out that the A of Om is the left wing, the U, the right, and the M, the tail of Kalahansa, the swan. Bestride the bird of life if thou wouldst know. So I think we'll stop there, and we can look more into the swan, into mythology, into any thoughts and ideas we might want to explore together. And I don't know if you want to take over to begin, Desiree, or
Yes, well, gosh,
I'll
that
try
was
to.
wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Does everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure
I'm going to try to get out of this. I forgot how. Okay.
that was wonderful.
Oh, here we go. Sorry.
Yeah, for helping us really explore the symbolism behind, and not just the swan, but all aquatic birds. I can see how when we see them as gods of the sky, how they represent an ascension. And so I can see how so much reverence was placed, especially given to aquatic birds, because aquatic birds actually can live on the ground, on land, in the water, and in the sky. So they're really adept at those three elements. And then when you think about the phoenix, now they're actually evolving beyond. So it's interesting that they picked including the pelican, which really comes up in a lot of our, in the Rosicrucians and in Christianity too. Thanks so much for that. Does anybody have any questions or comments to provide? And I can't see who's in the physical audience there in the lodge, so if I can have some help out there too. Well, let's see. I'm not seeing any right away. I do have an ask. Could you explain a little bit though about the black swan?
The black swan.
Yes.
Not too much actually, except to say that the black swan is in that long reading by HPB. It's inferred that the unmanifest is sometimes termed as the black swan, and then light, when light manifests, the universe comes forth. That's the white swan. So you might say symbolically, it's the esoteric side of things. It's the hidden. It's the source side. And I didn't show any, but there are black swans around. In Australia, I think maybe it's the main place where they live, but there are other places also, the black swan. So we can
That's
see
great.
how symbol you could see in that Hilma af Klint, that amazing first painting of hers, the black and white swan nose to nose. It's a beautiful
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah,
Great.
she had read the SD and a lot. Yeah, very interesting how she was influenced in her work. Yeah,
Thank you for that. So
yeah,
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 the white swan being like that ray
right.
from
And of course, Saraswati, in Indian and Hindu mythology, she's the white swan, and she's all the way back to the Rig Veda. She's mentioned there that far back as a swan, the river. She's considered the river goddess, and connected with the swan, and they can trace her that far back, and she becomes the goddess really of knowledge and wisdom.
wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah, the feminine, they're Brahma and Saraswati, the masculine and the feminine.
Good.
Jonathan.
I have a question, Sandra.
Go for it.
Name of the artist. I didn't really hear it or know how to spell it.
Oh, the artist.
Yes.
People often mix her up with the famous artist Klimt, but her name is Klint, Klint, Hilma, Hilma. Next little word, af, af, Klint,
Klint.
Klint.
Klintnc. Okay.
T like Tom.
Yeah, C like cow.
No, T like Tom.
Okay. T.
Jonathan.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, hi, David.
Hey there.
Beautiful, wonderful presentation. I'm so glad you did this. You quoted HPB. One of the quotes was that there's a logos to every mythos, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
And we're studying the logos in our Sunday morning group, kind of studying the secret doctrine by theme. So right now we're kind of focusing on the logos, but and we just barely started. If we were further along in the theme, maybe I'd be able to answer my own question. But anyway, my understanding of the logos is like the expression of the unmanifest, the word, and so forth.
Right.
But this here, is it something where the logos has something to do with like the wisdom? Or because just if you could unpack that phrase in relation to logos and what it means, and then why what's the point she's making with that whole phrase? Thank you.
Okay. You mean where I read it there?
Yeah, the one where you read it. There's a logos to every mythos.
Oh, there's a logos to every mythos. Well,
Yeah.
I read that it means that there's a truth.
Yeah.
Mythos. I guess the logos is to the divine, like what's the analogy made? Like speech is to thought. So it's the expression.
Okay.
And of course we have, that word's I guess most well known to people from the Bible, right? The word.
Yeah.
The word made flesh. Yeah.
And how would that fit in with the idea of what that kind of section that you were making there, where HP was saying that myths aren't just overheated fantasies?
Well, I had hoped that I kind of had some ammunition to show that when I was showing, on the physical planes, of course, the reality of places like Troy and Herculaneum, and behind these stories, there's great symbolic truths of all sorts.
Yeah. No, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Jim Tepper?
Um, Thank you, David. Like Jonathan, I thought you gave us a wonderful golden Ariadne's thread through the complex image and story and myth of the swan. My question is something like this: when one observes a swan
Yeah.
and sees it in flight, and you get a picture of it, particularly in flight, you see how elegant it is,
Right.
and how inspiring it is. But also, when you see it swimming in a lake, it's also quite beautiful and elegant. And it has something about it where, whether it's in heaven or on earth, there's something very wonderful and uplifting and aesthetically pleasing and so forth about the swan. It's an unusual kind of physical image in that sense.
Yeah.
Whether it's in flight or whether it's kind of mainly stationary, it still looks very, very inviting to the imagination, to the intuition. Now, here's my question. Here's my question. It's a creature, it's an aerial creature that can ascend or descend. And therefore, if it symbolizes in some sense the logos or wisdom, and at the same time, elegance and beauty and truth on earth, is there something then about the fact that it's aerial means it can move to the heavens and embrace wisdom and bring it down with grace and elegance to earth? Is there something about the mobility there, the ability to fly to the heights, to the heavens, and then descend to a lake, so to speak?
Right.
Is that helpful to us in terms of thinking of meditation on wisdom, compassion, etc.?
Personally, I think so. It's interesting. It said the swan, when it's in the water too, sometimes it said one of its qualities is that it doesn't get its feathers wet. I mean, it's in the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he comes out dry. So there's that beauty here. Actually, Jim, I thought Mary Oliver put it very beautifully in some of those last lines, heading to that, where she said, have you finally figured out what beauty is for? And then she ends her poem, have you changed your life? Has it opened you up maybe to the higher life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also the lotus too is a symbol. Its petals
Right.
don't wet either. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting point. Thank you for the correlation too.
Yeah, no, but I agree. It's pretty amazing. And I think people are continually inspired by the swan. And there's many more examples we could have done, in literature and history and poets. Often they're taking off from the myths of the past, like Leda and the Swan. Like Yeats wrote a famous poem about Leda, just as one
As
example.
a footnote to that point, once when I was with my family at Disneyland in Anaheim, and it was very chaotic and hot and everything, and we were struggling to get over to Fantasyland and the castle. It's a bridge over some waters. And they happen to have just some lovely swans that were swimming in the waters. And we all stopped and looked at it. And I know somehow it just settled all our minds. We saw something so beautiful, so gracious, so unostentatious, and just swimming along. And then we kind of regained our enthusiasm and our sense of calmness and serenity for the rest of the time in Disneyland.
Wow.
Anyway, it's just even on the physical plane, it can have a good effect.
Right. So you've had personal experience with the swan, right?
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. I had personal experience with one too, but it wasn't positive.
Yeah, they can be nasty at times.
They get pretty aggressive too because they're so protective,
Yeah. I was just going to say, one other aspect of the swan that gets into our thought processes, and it's been here for a long time.
Yeah,
is the idea of you've heard this, I'm sure, the idea of one swan song.
Yeah,
and one swan song is like one's. It means one's final great effort at something, like maybe a person's an author's last great book, or an athlete's last great, year or game at something. That it's called their swan song, and that actually comes from the idea, although it may be apocryphal, but it's been around for a long, long time, that the swan isn't really that vocal like the mute you've heard, like our most common swan here in the U.S., although it's not indigenous here, is the mute swan, the one we showed with the yellow beak, orange beak. Supposedly at the end of its life, it just belts out this kind of haunting, melodious song before it died, and that's where we get this idea of the swan song.
Mhm.
Really?
And yeah, and people have used it for like a long time. Even I read that that Da Vinci in his writings refers to, he uses that phrase just in that way, the swan song. So it's been around for a long time, that idea of one swan song.
Yes.
Wow.
That has an interesting correlation with what they discovered about trees, that in certain communities of trees, when a tree is dying, it releases its nutrients such that it goes out and benefits the whole community while dying.
Wow, amazing.
Isn't that a marvelous idea?
It's amazing.
Something like that perhaps correlates.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
David.
Luca.
Good afternoon, all, and happy anniversary of Kuan Yin Enlightenment this week.
Oh, wow.
Very timely subject. Yeah, you mentioned the Song of the Swan, and it just happened that HPB in collective writing, you can find the last Song of the Swan, which is a very powerful message, and that article is beautiful, and it's in relation to what you just said. It's been around. And another point that I thought that was very interesting is that you were talking about the symbolism, like all this different symbolism help us awaken something within us. And especially at the beginning, the writing had at first no character. They were just but general symbols that stood for the phrase, and then the way we have our language, the way that we write things, have no character. Like the Chinese written language is more symbolical, but ours is not. But certainly there's so many hidden mysteries in all these beautiful symbols, and we know that even they were talking about other birds. The eagle is considered by the Native American and other traditions something sacred and represent the East.
Laura brought a lot of that out in her talk on the eagle, I remember.
Yeah, and it represents the East, the rebirth, the beginning, and all these birds, because they fly, and they're not. I mean, I know that this is in the water, but also have wings. So it's almost like help us maybe to remind us that if we do going the right path, we're going to get wings too. Thank you.
Thank you, Maluka. Just checking in with the audience in the lodge just to make sure we don't have anybody there that has a question or comment. Jonathan or Monica? Are we okay out there?
We got a question here.
Okay.
Ed messed up his back, so it'll only take an hour for him to get up there.
Yes. Like, whoa. Oh my God.
Is that Ken? Okay.
There. Yes. Thank you, David, and for that wonderful presentation, and Desiree for the comments. I was wondering about the Irish myth. So I understand Lear is one of the people there, and it looked like there was some connection to Bridget as well. And was there a curse involved, or why are the children of Lear?
The children of Lear?
Yes, in the Irish myth.
Well, do you know what it is, or you're asking?
I'm asking about it. I don't know much.
Okay. Well, just very, very briefly, I like it. From what I understand, at first it was passed down orally for a long time, so things kind of changed. And when it was written down around 1500, that's sort of the story we get now from that time. But Lear, he was a king, and he had these daughters, and after his wife died, if I have it right, he remarried his wife's younger sister. Okay. And
okay.
no, that's not the good part though. And he had, of course, love and, everything for his wife still, but mainly for his daughters. So she got jealous about all his attention to his daughters, the new wife, and she put a curse on them and turned them into swans.
Okay.
And they lived for 900 years trapped in the swans. And then the story goes when Christianity, I'm not sure quite how that worked. When Christianity came to Ireland, somehow the spell was broken, and they were freed. So,
Oh, right.
but there's been a lot of offshoots and retellings of this story in different ways. But I don't know. Does that answer your question? Kind of. But that's what I think you were talking about. Yeah.
Yes, that the Lear, the children of Lear. That's fascinating. Because I do like the ballet actually, and
well, that the ballet came out of that, right? Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you for that connection. Appreciate it.
I just wanted to. You got me interested now in the symbolism, and on page 80 at the footnote of this SD, it says here whether the genus of the bird be Cygnus, answer or Pelecanus. Can't really read in this light.
Oh.
It is no matter, as it is an aquatic bird floating or moving on the waters like the spirit, and then issuing from those waters to give birth to other beings. The true significance of the symbol of the 18th degree of the rosy cross, and I think there's some symbology there too with the rosy cross, is precisely this. Though poeticized later on into the motherly feeling of the pelican rending its bosom to feed 7 little ones with its blood.
Right.
And when you think about the 7, principles and all that. So it is this container, very feminine, because it is that container holding the creative spirit in its various potentiality, its various principles. So it's a sacrifice, though, at the same time.
Yeah, the pelican was.
Look at it as not just a protective thing or a means of expression, but it's also a sacrifice.
Yeah, the story of the pelican when it had it didn't have any food for its young. It, like you just said, it pecked open its own breast and feeds its young. That's the story.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really, really interesting. Oh, Laura, go for it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Somewhere. Yeah.
Oh. There you are. Okay.
Isn't there somewhere where it speaks of the swan being able to filter the water from the milk?
Oh, yeah.
Kind of a symbol of discernment there. Do you remember where that is from, David? I just have a vague memory of it.
I think one of the stories was Saraswati. I think that that comes from. But in the reading I gave earlier, HPV was talking about. She refers to it as the allegory, where the milk is spirit and the water is matter, and there's enough knowledge to separate the two. Yeah, that's right. It took the milk and left the water. Right.
You mentioned that
and leaving the illusion of matter. I mean, you could look at it. Right.
The essence. Yeah. The essence.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
To relating that to discretion, true discretion.
Yeah.
It's hard to know sometimes. Yeah.
Anyone else? Thank you, Laura.
Right.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
I have a little question though. She says in ancient times, and of course, the Swan is interwoven through a lot of stories and myths. Mythology is what passed on a lot of the truths and were kept there. But how vital is mythology today? In other words, do you think these ancient myths, besides us theos, really into it, can be useful to the general education of people, or people, or has science replaced that? Some people say, the myths were from the past and now we have science. Or is there a way we can interblend those and keep alive the because there's something like Jim was saying, the beauty of these stories and myths does something within us that just kind of cold facts and and charts and stuff like that just don't do.
We think that myth
Maluka?
takes us. Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
No, don't we think that myth takes us beyond the words?
That's a nice.
Which is really important. It brings to mind what Mr. Judge says, to read between the lines. And so myth is the image making power that takes us beyond the written word.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
Maluka?
Yes, I think we are left with the symbolism of the pyramids while it's still standing, and in different countries, as we know, in Mexico and different, even in China recently they discovered a hidden pyramid, by the way. And there are more things coming out from the ocean, and I think eventually maybe some of these symbols, it will mean more in the future, and it might mean more that maybe that they're drawing that exist, in the pyramids and different caves that have discovered. And recently they were saying, why is it that it's always this Indian or Hindus, Indian native, they always have these huge heads. Why is that? And somebody was saying maybe you have to do that is because that's what the mind is. The mind is in the head. That's, the crown chakra. Then another thing that it was interesting that I found out recently, they were saying that why is it that the Mahatma and Dalai Lama always wear hats, and some of them look like a little lotus by the crown of the head? So all the things, maybe hidden doesn't mean a lot. The colors and all that, it have a meaning and it waking something at us. But I think the greatest challenge we have right now is the distraction of our technology. And now with the artificial intelligence, it's going to be very challenging to find out what is truth. And all the local newspaper that they were keeping, investigation and keeping alive the real truth among, what's going on in towns, they are disappearing. So we're going to be left with the internet and all this technology that it have a lot of invention. The truth is not always revealed. And the abuse of the language, how people abuse and misuse the power of the word, which is so important and sacred. And I think that for me, and Einstein said, the day the technology surpass the humanity, we're going to end up with a generation of idiots.
Thanks for that wonderful news, Maluka. Well, and I know Jonathan's waiting to say a thing or two, and I just want to interject here that I think that the oral tradition and also the storytelling tradition isn't going away. And I think people, if they're not told what to think, but if they read a story and there's a moral, there's some kind of a teaching within it, then they feel that they're picking up on the teaching without being sermoned to. There's a difference because it awakens something within themselves. So I think storytelling, such as stories such as Jonathan Livingston Seagull And the ugly duckling may seem just like a little kid's story on the surface, but it really can, I believe, generate some deeper feelings in the human spirit. So I really do think that these stories, even the simplest ones, kept alive, help us to, well, it helps us to rethink and refeel and put things together on our own without being told this is what you need to, think and believe, and et cetera, et cetera. Sorry to take your time there, Jonathan.
Oh, not at all. Matter of fact, you covered a lot of what I was going to go into and much better than how I was going to do it. So I appreciate that. Something recalls to mind that HPB has a quote that says, "Symbols were not invented for the amusement of the ignorant. They are the alpha and omega of philosophic thought." That is a pretty strong statement. So if that's true of symbols, it seems like it would be true of analogies and allegories, and anything and because all these things have to do with buddhi, and as Jim Teffer was mentioning, he thanked you for your Ariadne's thread, and I think there's another statement by HPB that analogy and correspondence are the Ariadne's thread, and they have to do with the awakening of these cognitive faculties that we all have, but are dormant for the most part, really. And one of the things that arouses and awakens that dormant eye of intuition within all human beings is stories, well-told stories. And because they're based on really archetypes. And these are the enduring and abiding wisdom points in all cultures. And it's amazing how these analogies and stories, like the swan, are so universal, as you pointed out in your presentation. And think about how many cultures and civilizations we've all been born in. If humanity is 18 million years old, and if the average life cycle, reincarnation cycle is 1,500 years, that comes out to 12,000 lifetimes just in the recent cycle. So think about how many cultures we've been in. And so these stories, think of how many times we've all heard some version of these stories. As you said, you were making the point that these stories kind of have an evolution and they take a life of their own. So they change through the generations, but it's the basic thread, and but it would seem that these symbols and stories and so forth would awaken soul memories. And it was such a golden thing for anybody who was able to go to theosophy school during that cycle. And the fundamental thing of that was storytelling, really. And it was so beautiful to see adults and children and adults of all ages kind of learning the art of storytelling. Learning what works, what doesn't work, how to keep the interest, how to make it cool and interesting, but on the other hand, deliver the archetype, and the moral that's kind of coming through that story. But maybe we'll revive the tradition someday. Who knows? So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Once again, I don't see any more hands in the audience.
Well, I don't know if anyone had read this, but it was
go for it.
Maybe at the beginning, what Jonathan was saying about the buddhi. That's in the Aquarian Almanac here. That's for today. That's the saying from Hermes. It says the swan partakes of heaven and earth, eternity and time, symbolically portraying the androgynous nature of buddhi.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Well, again, a wonderful presentation, great discussion. And I guess we will close a little bit early. And if we don't have any more questions, I just want to thank everybody for being here and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening.